On a morning in October 1963, a wrecking ball swung into the granite facade of Pennsylvania Station in New York City. Columns that had stood for half a century crumbled into rubble. Eagles carved from stone were loaded onto flatbed trucks and hauled to a landfill in the New Jersey Meadowlands. The building had been modeled after the ancient baths of Caracalla in Rome, and for 50 years it had served as the grandest railroad terminal in the Western Hemisphere. Now it was being demolished to make room for a sports arena and an office tower above a cramped underground concourse. The railroad that built it, the Pennsylvania Railroad, had once been the largest corporation in America, the largest railroad on the planet, an empire that employed more people than the United States Army in peacetime. By the time that wrecking ball swung, the empire was already dying. This is the story of how the Pennsylvania Railroad rose, how it ruled, and how it collapsed so completely that even its name disappeared from the American landscape. The Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered on April 13, 1846, and it was born out of fear. Pennsylvania's merchants and politicians had been watching the competition with mounting alarm for 2 decades. The Erie Canal had been funneling trade from the Great Lakes toward New York City since the 1820s, turning Manhattan into the commercial hub of the eastern seaboard. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, was pulling commerce southward toward Baltimore and the Chesapeake. Philadelphia, which had served as the commercial capital of the young republic since before independence, was losing ground on both flanks. The state had already tried to fight back with a contraption called the Main Line of Public Works, a bizarre hybrid system that combined stretches of canal with inclined plane railroads to haul canal boats over the Allegheny Mountains on rails. Stationary steam engines perched at the top of each incline would winch the boats up one side of the ridge and lower them down the other. It worked, technically. Boats did cross the mountains, but the system was painfully slow, horrendously expensive to maintain, and a source of constant embarrassment compared to what New York and Maryland were building with real railroads and real canals. The new Pennsylvania Railroad was supposed to end that embarrassment for good. The route would run west from the state capital at Harrisburg, through the layered ridges of the Alleghenies, all the way to Pittsburgh and the Ohio River Valley beyond, where the commerce of the interior waited. The engineering challenge was enormous. The Alleghenies are not a single wall of rock. They are a series of long, parallel ridges separated by narrow valleys, each one running northeast to southwest like the ribs of some immense buried animal. Every ridge meant a grinding climb. Every valley meant a descent, and then another climb. The railroad's chief engineer, J. Edgar Thompson, spent months surveying the mountains before he found his solution at a place called Kittening Point, near the settlement that would grow into the city of Altoona. Rather than blasting a tunnel straight through the ridge, which would have cost a fortune and taken years, Thompson designed a sweeping horseshoe-shaped curve that wrapped around the shoulder of the mountain, gaining elevation gradually over a long, graceful arc. Horseshoe Curve opened in 1854. It was an immediate engineering landmark, celebrated in newspapers and technical journals across the country. Engineers and tourists traveled from as far as Europe to see it. Trains still use it today, still curving around that same mountainside, hauling coal and intermodal containers on tracks that follow the alignment Thompson laid out more than 170 years ago. By the time the line reached Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania Railroad had accomplished something more important than completing a route. It had proven that a private corporation could do what the state government had tried and failed to do. The old main line of public works was put up for sale not long after. The railroad bought most of it at auction, dismantled the inclines, and let the canals go dry. J. Edgar Thompson did not just build the railroad's route, he built its identity. He became president in 1852 and spent the next 22 years turning the Pennsylvania Railroad into something no American corporation had been before, a centrally managed, vertically integrated industrial system with standards that applied uniformly across every mile of track and every piece of rolling stock. Thompson was not a showman. He rarely gave speeches, disliked press attention, and let the railroad's operating results speak for themselves. Where other railroad presidents of the era were speculators and stock manipulators who treated their companies as personal piggy banks, Thompson was an engineer who believed that disciplined operational efficiency was the surest route to sustained profit. Under his direction, the railroad built its massive locomotive and car shops at Altoona, Pennsylvania. The Altoona Works eventually grew into one of the largest industrial complexes in the country, employing thousands of skilled workers who designed, tested, and assembled locomotives to the railroad's own exacting specifications. The Pennsylvania Railroad did not simply go to outside builders and buy whatever was cheapest. It developed its own locomotive classes, each one refined through systematic testing, and demanded that every engine conform to standards that ensured interchangeability across the entire system. This insistence on standardization was decades ahead of standard American business practice. It meant that a locomotive built at Altoona could be maintained at any shop on the system with the same parts and the same procedures. Thompson extended the same philosophy to freight cars, signal systems, track specifications, bridges, and culverts. Everything was designed to work together as components of a single integrated machine. He also understood that the value of a railroad lay not in any single line between two cities, but in the network those lines formed together. He pushed the system eastward to Jersey City, across the Hudson River from Manhattan, and southward toward Washington and Baltimore, absorbing smaller railroads along the way. He bought some outright. Others he leased on terms so favorable to the Pennsylvania that they amounted to permanent control. By the time Thompson died in 1874, worn out and in failing health, the Pennsylvania Railroad operated thousands of miles of track stretching across multiple states. It was the largest private enterprise in the world, measured by revenue, by the number of people it employed, and by the sheer volume of goods it moved. His partner and successor, Thomas A. Scott, was a very different kind of leader. Scott had served as Assistant Secretary of War during the Civil War, managing military railroad operations for the Union Army. He understood political power and legislative influence the way Thompson understood grade percentages and tractive effort. Scott was ambitious, deeply connected, and entirely willing to wield the railroad's growing influence to shape elections, legislation, and public policy. Under Scott, the Pennsylvania Railroad's reach extended well beyond the rails themselves. By the 1880s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had earned a title that it wore like a badge of rank: the Standard Railroad of the World. The name was not a marketing invention. It described a genuine corporate philosophy that permeated every aspect of the operation, from the weight of the rail spiked to its cross ties to the architectural details of its smallest rural station. Tuscan red became the signature color, applied to passenger cars, freight cabooses, water towers, and station trim, so that anyone who saw it knew instantly which railroad they were dealing with. The main line between New York and Chicago, running through Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and across the flat farmland of Ohio and Indiana, was one of the most heavily trafficked rail corridors on Earth. Dozens of passenger trains ran every day. Freight trains moved in a nearly continuous procession. The Broadway Limited, the railroad's flagship passenger service, competed directly with the New York Central's 20th Century Limited for the title of the finest long-distance train in the United States. Both trains offered sleeping cars, dining service, observation lounges, barbershops, and secretarial services. Both ran on schedules of roughly 20 hours between the same two cities. The competition between these two trains was personal, public, and obsessive. The rivalry between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central was one of the great corporate confrontations of American industrial history. The Pennsylvania took the southern route through Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The New York Central took the northern route along the Hudson River Valley and through Buffalo. They competed for passengers, for freight contracts, for access to the same industrial cities, and for political influence in Washington and in state capitals across the Northeast and Midwest. Their executives watched each other's annual reports with the attention of chess players studying a board. At its zenith, the Pennsylvania Railroad was not merely a transportation company. It was a political force, a financial institution, and an industrial empire compressed into a single corporate entity. Its board of directors included some of the most powerful figures in American banking, steel, and manufacturing. Its political influence reached deep into state legislatures and into the chambers of the United States Congress. In Philadelphia, where its headquarters occupied a commanding building on Broad Street, the railroad was known simply as the Pennsy. And what the Pennsy wanted, the Pennsy usually got. City councils deferred to it. State regulators accommodated it. Federal lawmakers understood that opposing the Pennsylvania Railroad carried real political consequences. Pause for 1 second. For all its power, there was one humiliation the Pennsylvania Railroad could not seem to shake. Its trains could not reach Manhattan. The railroad's passenger terminal sat across the Hudson River in Jersey City, New Jersey, and every traveler bound for the center of New York had to leave the train, walk to a ferry slip, and cross the river by boat. In winter, when ice clogged the Hudson, the crossing could take the better part of an hour. The New York Central, by contrast, ran its trains directly into the heart of the city at Grand Central Depot on 42nd Street. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, this was not just an inconvenience. It was a competitive wound that reopened every time a passenger chose the Central over the Pennsy, because the Central did not involve a ferry. Alexander Johnston Cassatt became president of the railroad in 1899, and he resolved to fix the problem permanently. His plan was one of the most audacious infrastructure projects of the early 20th century. He would bore twin tunnels under the Hudson River from New Jersey to Manhattan, build a monumental passenger terminal on the west side of the island between 31st and 33rd Streets, then continue with additional tunnels under the East River to connect with the Long Island Railroad in Queens. The entire underground operation would run on electric power, because steam locomotives could not safely operate in tunnels of that length without suffocating their own crews and passengers. The Hudson River tunnels were brutal to construct. Workers descended into pressurized chambers where compressed air was pumped in to hold back the water and saturated silt of the riverbed. The air pressure caused crippling joint pain, nosebleeds, and a condition known as caisson disease. Men were killed by blowouts, sudden catastrophic ruptures where the compressed air burst through a weak point in the riverbed and sent a violent column of water and mud crashing into the tunnel face. Despite the dangers, the tunnels were completed, and above them rose Pennsylvania Station. The architects McKim, Meade, and White had designed a building intended to declare that the Pennsylvania Railroad was not merely a private company, but a civic institution, deserving comparison with the great public monuments of Imperial Rome. The main waiting room featured a vaulted ceiling rising to more than 150 feet. Daylight streamed through enormous panes of glass. The train concourse, a soaring steel and glass canopy over the platforms below, made arriving passengers feel as though they had stepped into a cathedral built for the age of the locomotive. Cassatt did not live to see his station completed. He died in December 1906, 7 years before the building opened its doors. The man who dreamed it into existence, who fought for it against skeptics on his own board, never stood beneath its vaulted ceiling. Pause for 1 second. The Pennsylvania Railroad entered the middle decades of the 20th century at the apex of its power and influence. In the 1930s, it electrified its heavily trafficked main line between New York and Washington, replacing steam locomotives on that corridor with the GG1 electric locomotive, a machine whose sleek, streamlined casing was styled by the industrial designer Raymond Loewy. The GG1 was fast, powerful, smooth in acceleration, and could operate in either direction without needing to be turned around on a turntable. The design was so successful that it outlived the railroad that commissioned it. GG1s hauled trains on the Northeast Corridor well into the 1980s under successive operators, decades after the Pennsylvania Railroad itself had vanished. The electrified corridor between New York and Washington became one of the most intensively operated stretches of railroad on the continent. Trains ran at frequencies that rivaled urban transit systems, and the overhead catenary wires that powered them became as much a part of the landscape between Trenton and Wilmington as the smokestacks and row houses that lined the tracks. It became one of the most recognizable and celebrated locomotives in American railroad history. During the Second World War, the railroad carried staggering volumes of military traffic. Troop trains ran day and night on the main line. Freight trains loaded with tanks, ammunition, raw steel, aviation fuel, and countless tons of war material moved eastward toward the Atlantic ports. The Pennsylvania Railroad was essential military infrastructure, as vital to the war effort as any shipyard, munitions plant, or aircraft factory. But the war effort, which brought record traffic volumes and gave the railroad a sense of indispensability, also masked a structural crisis that had already been building for years. The federal government was investing massively in highways and airports, and air traffic control systems. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, which opened in 1940, ran almost parallel to the railroad's own main line through the Alleghenies, carrying automobiles and long-haul trucks over the same mountains that Thompson had conquered with Horseshoe Curve nearly a century earlier. After the war ended, the trends accelerated. Automobile ownership surged as returning servicemen started families and moved to new suburbs built along highway corridors. Commercial airlines began offering scheduled service between major cities at prices that middle-class travelers could afford. Trucking companies, operating on a publicly funded interstate highway system, offered door-to-door delivery that no railroad could match. The railroad's cost structure was merciless. Track, bridges, tunnels, stations, signal systems, massive shops, and a workforce numbering in the hundreds of thousands all had to be maintained regardless of whether the trains ran full or empty. Revenue, meanwhile, was shrinking. Passenger traffic declined year after year as travelers chose cars and planes. Freight shippers discovered that trucks were faster and more flexible for most loads. By the late 1950s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was losing tens of millions of dollars annually on passenger operations alone, and the freight business was under relentless competitive pressure from the trucking industry. Regulatory constraints made the situation worse. The Interstate Commerce Commission controlled freight rates and made it extraordinarily difficult for railroads to abandon unprofitable branch lines and passenger routes. The railroad was compelled by law to keep running trains that almost nobody rode, to stations that served almost nobody, at fares that did not come close to covering the cost of operation. Meanwhile, the physical plant was deteriorating. Deferred maintenance accumulated year after year. Track that needed replacing was patched instead. Bridges that needed rebuilding were reinforced with temporary measures that became permanent by neglect. The great stations, those monuments to corporate confidence, became financial burdens rather than symbols of prestige. Pennsylvania Station in New York, Cassatt's masterwork, was costing far more to maintain than it was generating in revenue. The railroad's leadership began to view the building not as a cathedral, but as a liability, a vast, expensive shell sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan. The decision to demolish it and sell the air rights above the tracks was, in hindsight, the moment the railroad publicly admitted that its past was worth more dead than alive. What came next would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, rivals that had competed relentlessly for more than 100 years, began discussing the possibility of merging into a single company. Both railroads were hemorrhaging cash. Both were burdened by aging infrastructure, declining traffic, enormous labor costs, and a regulatory framework that seemed designed to prevent them from adapting to a world that no longer depended on trains the way it once had. The logic of the merger seemed simple enough on paper. Two weakened railroads could combine into one stronger one, eliminate hundreds of miles of duplicate routes, consolidate overlapping yards and terminals, and cut overhead costs by tens of millions of dollars per year. The merger was formally proposed in 1961. It took 7 years of regulatory hearings, legal challenges, union negotiations, and political maneuvering before the Interstate Commerce Commission finally granted approval. On February 1, 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad both ceased to exist. In their place stood a new corporate entity called the Penn Central Transportation Company. It was the largest merger in American corporate history up to that point. The problems began almost from the first day of combined operations. The two railroads had spent a century evolving in fundamentally different directions. They used different signal systems. They followed different operating procedures. Their equipment met different mechanical standards. Their computer systems for tracking freight cars were incompatible with each other. The Pennsylvania Railroad had always been a tightly centralized organization where decisions flowed downward from the headquarters in Philadelphia. The New York Central had operated with considerably more autonomy at the regional and divisional level. Forcing the two together was less like merging two companies and more like compelling two nations with different languages, different laws, and different customs to govern themselves through a single bureaucracy overnight. Freight cars vanished into the combined system and could not be located for days or even weeks. Trains were routed onto branch lines whose track could not support their weight. Schedules disintegrated. Employees from the two predecessor railroads distrusted one another and in some cases actively sabotaged coordination efforts. The management team, led by Stuart Saunders, who had come from the Pennsylvania Railroad side, was later accused of devoting more attention to real estate speculation and corporate financial engineering than to the basic, unglamorous, essential work of running a railroad. Cash was burning at a terrifying rate. In the yards, the situation was visible to anyone who cared to look. Locomotives sat idle because nobody could figure out which division was supposed to service them. Freight cars loaded with perishable goods sat on sidings for days because dispatchers using one computer system could not communicate with dispatchers using the other. Shippers began filing damage claims at unprecedented rates. Some simply took their business to trucking companies and never came back. The railroad's track deteriorated rapidly because maintenance budgets were slashed to cover operating losses. Slow orders, mandatory speed restrictions imposed on sections of track too degraded for normal operations multiplied across the system. Trains that had once moved at mainline speeds now crawled through sections of their own railroad at walking pace. The company that was supposed to save both railroads was destroying them faster than either could have declined on its own. On June 21, 1970, the Penn Central Transportation Company filed for bankruptcy protection in a federal court. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The news sent shockwaves through Wall Street, through the banking industry, and through the halls of Congress. Tens of thousands of railroad workers faced an uncertain future. Major industrial shippers who depended on Penn Central for daily freight service scrambled for alternatives that did not exist. Banks and insurance companies that had extended hundreds of millions of dollars in credit faced staggering losses on their balance sheets. The Nixon administration briefly considered a direct federal bailout, but the political risk was judged too high, and the proposal was quietly shelved. The bankruptcy exposed something much larger than the failure of a single corporation, however large. It revealed that the entire railroad industry across the northeastern United States was in a systemic crisis. Within just a few years, several other major northeastern railroads filed for bankruptcy or slid to the brink of insolvency. The Erie-Lackawanna, the Reading Company, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and others. The rail network that had built the industrial economy of the American Northeast was collapsing simultaneously, weakened by the same forces of highway competition, deferred maintenance, regulatory rigidity, and decades of declining revenue. Congress responded with the Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1973, which created the Consolidated Rail Corporation, better known as Conrail. Conrail absorbed the viable freight operations of Penn Central and half a dozen other bankrupt carriers, and began the long, painful, enormously expensive process of rebuilding a functional freight railroad from the wreckage. It took well over a decade and billions of dollars in federal investment before Conrail became financially self-sustaining. The company did eventually turn a profit, and in 1999 it was divided between two surviving railroad systems, Norfolk Southern and CSX Transportation. The passenger services that the Pennsylvania Railroad had once operated were handed to a new national entity called Amtrak, which began operations in 1971. Today, Amtrak's busiest corridor, the Northeast Corridor between Washington and Boston, still runs on infrastructure that the Pennsylvania Railroad built and electrified in the 1930s. The tunnels under the Hudson are the same tunnels that Casat's workers bored through silt and bedrock more than a century ago. They were damaged by saltwater flooding during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and their deteriorating condition has made the construction of new Hudson River crossings one of the most urgent and expensive infrastructure projects in the United States. The irony is difficult to miss. More than a century after Casat drove those tunnels under the river to prove that the Pennsylvania Railroad could conquer any obstacle, the tunnels themselves have become the obstacle, and no single entity has been able to muster the will or the resources to replace them with the same decisiveness that built them in the first place. Pause 1 second. The Pennsylvania Railroad once employed 250,000 people. It operated more than 10,000 miles of track across a dozen states. It built a station in New York that architects compared to the civic monuments of ancient Rome, and then it tore that station down because it could no longer afford to keep it standing. The corporate name is gone. The Tuscan red paint that once marked every piece of rolling stock and every rural station platform has faded from the landscape entirely. The Broadway Limited, that flagship of American rail travel that once carried movie stars and senators between New York and Chicago in sleeper cars with fresh linen and dining service on real china, made its final, quiet, half-empty run in 1995. The Altoona shops that built thousands of locomotives to the railroad's own demanding specifications closed decades ago. The headquarters on Broad Street in Philadelphia houses other tenants now. But west of Altoona, where the Alleghenies fold into their long parallel ridges, freight trains still lean into Horseshoe Curve the way they have since 1854. The railroad that built it no longer exists. The curve does. Pause 1 second.